So what the fuck is modular? Modular synthesis is it's a modality for making music. It's a little bit different from that Casio keyboard Grandma got you for Christmas. That does a lot of stuff under the hood, whereas in this case, basically everything you want to do, you need to roll yourself. You need to patch between the modules and make the fancy things happen. Now, what's interesting about modular synthesis is it's been it's still kind of in development. Going back to what, I guess the 70s, we had Moog and Buchla and a few other developers. And then over time, it seemed like anyone who wanted to make a modular system would literally make their own system. And so that's why we see things like Frac Rack and Paya, MOTM, Music from Outer Space. And they all have different sized modules, they have different output levels, they have different power requirements. It was a mess. In the mid-90s, Dieter Doepfer, who was the brainiac behind Dope for Music, or Dope for Electronic Music, he said that we should standardize the way these modules are made in terms of their size, power requirements, output, etc. And it took off. And now, I mean, there's probably a dozen different manufacturers represented on this rack alone, and there's so many more than that. At a high level, modular synthesis is a modality. There's something very special about using the patch cables and about the lack of permanence. As soon as I unplug all these cables, the sound goes away, and I would have to perfectly recreate the patching, the settings on the knobs, but also the settling of the voltage in the rack. Many people out there know that sometimes if you power cycle the rack, it's never going to sound the same when you turn it back on. And so that lets you, think about and approach sound design, sound art, and music a little bit differently. In the modular synthesis world, we really have about 4 main categories of modules. We have sound sources. For example, I've got my 4MS ensemble here, which I love, and my Disting is working as a sample player right now. I've also got Squarp Rample, which is a sample playback device. I've got some percussion. The percussion you're hearing is coming off of this. We also have modulators. A modulator is anything that can generate a control voltage that allows you to change the parameters on the modules over time. So if we take a look here, there's 2 different sources of control voltage that we're seeing that are being generated by the rack. One is a gate, it's just an on-off, often used as a trigger. And this one is an envelope, which is controlling the contour of the loudness in the sound that you're hearing. We also have effects. The only real effects I have in this rack right now is Ghost, which is a collaboration between Endorphins and Andrew Huang. And it's great, small package, lots of functionality, I love it. And the fourth and potentially one of the biggest categories would be utilities, or at least that's what I call them. These are things that are kind of the glue between modules or the glue between your modular rack and the outside world. So for example, I've got a MIDI to control voltage adapter here that allows me to plug in a USB keyboard or generate CV control voltage on my computer. I've got a really fancy microphone preamp over here, which is great for bringing any kind of sound source into the rack. And one of my favorites is this Ornament in Crime, which is, well, it's a lot of things. We'll talk about those in a future video. I think what we should do now is we should unpatch everything and sort of walk through some of the basic concepts and use the oscilloscope to sort of talk about things as we go. Silence. Let's go back to the different types of modules that we talked about. So the first thing is sound sources. Now, as I mentioned, I've got a few different sound sources here. The most basic of which, though in this case this is a really complicated oscillator, but the most basic is an oscillator. And what it does is it generates sound. In this case, it's a series of sine waves that have a specific harmonic relationship to each other. And I love it. This thing is so good for making sort of ambient tracks or chords. I've made a lot of sort of house grooves with this actually, which will be coming up in future videos. And so as a sound source, it has an output that goes to your speakers, but usually most oscillators have a whole bunch of different inputs that allow you to control different parameters. Most of these inputs correspond to the different knobs. So we have the root control, we have cross frequency modulation, a function called twist, and a function called warp. I don't want to mess with the other ones because it'll ruin the sound we get in the end. So that's the sound source. We also have this Disting by Expert Sleepers. It does a whole bunch of things. Right now it's in sample playback. And I've got some old school, it's either a radio play or a commercial.
Family. Oh, the big red letters stand for the Jello family.
It's a commercial. And what's neat is this also has some parameters. I can control when the sound starts playing, where in the sample it starts playing from. It's pretty neat, right? So you can do a whole bunch of things with that. And also there's the Squarp Rumple, which is a little bit, here, I'll patch it up. So what it is it's 4 different sample players and you've got some effects control, and this is where the percussion was coming from. Okay, now that's interesting. Let's talk about what's going on here. I'm plugging a modulator into Squarp Rumple. What's a modulator? So a modulator generates all sorts of voltages that we use to control all the things. One of the most simple types, which I'm going to bring up on the yellow trace here, is a gate. So as you can see, when this voltage goes up and down, different modules can recognize that as a trigger. And I'm going to take that same voltage and I'm going to use it to trigger that kick beat again. And you will see what I mean. Just like that. So gates, very, very important. If we want something to go, we need a gate. Under the hood, Grandma's Casio keyboard, when you press the key, a gate or a trigger is being generated and being sent out into the system to say, hey, do the stuff now, right? Now, there's also the traditional control voltage. And I'm going to use this module here. It's just a bank of LFOs, or low frequency oscillators, which is a fancy way of saying an oscillator like this that refreshes or updates or moves way slower than audio rate. So we can't hear it, but we can see it and we can use it to drive things. So let's take that same yellow trace, and that's what that LFO looks like. Now, we can use this voltage to control different features of modules. So let's plug in our oscillator, and now I'm going to use this voltage to change a parameter on this. Let's do, we can do pitch. Let's do pitch. This will sound kind of spaceshipy, but it's obviously over the top enough that you get it. And I can slow this down. We can get glacially slow to coin Div Kid. And down. Now that's affecting pitch. What if we affect, for example, the scale, not the scale, the root knob? I don't care what you think, I think that's super satisfying. So that's control voltage. So we can also, though, generate a special type of control voltage called an envelope. And the easiest way to think about an envelope is when you're looking at a waveform of something. Say you're listening, or you're looking at the waveform of a snare drum. The waveform is going to start big and flat and then slowly taper off like that, right? That's the envelope of the sound. And you can apply envelopes to anything, because again, it's just a control voltage that can go onto any of the parameters of a module. But when you've got certain utilities like a voltage-controlled amplifier, or a module that changes the amplification of a sound based on voltage, you can then start to apply a volume curve to things. So if we take our oscillator and plug it into our VCA, and then we're going to come out of the VCA into our speakers, into our mixer, you see that we've just got a different volume knob now, right? But if we put voltage into here, we can automate this knob. So if we wanted to mimic something like a real instrument, like maybe a mallet or the pressing of keys on a keyboard, we would use something called an envelope generator, or in this case, I've got a dual ADSR, a dual attack, decay, sustain, and release. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So you can see this red light is when I'm pushing the button, and you can see I get a generation of voltage up here. Well, here's a full attack, and it stays lit as long as I push it. But I can also add some release to it, and it starts to control the contour of the sound. I can also add a little bit of a slower attack, and we start to get a shark fin style envelope. If we take some control voltage and attach it to the pitch, what we get is we get a pitch that corresponds to the voltage at this patch point right here, which is great, but it doesn't really sound like music. This is where something called quantizing comes into play, and many of you have probably heard of quantizing when it comes to keyboards or drum machines, where the software will try and scooch the trigger or the hit that you've done to the closest sort of slot on the timeline, so it sounds like you've got good rhythm even though you don't. But we can use quantizing on voltages so we get musical notes. Now that's why I like this Ornaments in Crime, because it's got a really, really good quantizing algorithm in it. And what we're going to do is we're going to use Ornaments in Crime to quantize this voltage into specific steps that align with a scale. So I'm putting this control voltage that you see here into Ornaments in Crime, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a gate to trigger this thing into scooching that voltage to a specific voltage that relates to a pitch. Now what we get is this. So every time a gate goes into Ornaments in Crime, it's locking the voltage to a certain step, turning this voltage into this voltage. Okay, so if we instead pull our voltage from this trace, starts to sound a little more musical. Is it starting to make sense yet? Okay, but when we listen to music, we don't hear just a constant droning sound that changes pitches. We have some dynamics in there. We have envelopes on these notes. This same trigger that this same gate that we were using to trigger Ornaments in Crime, I'm going to split out, and we'll put one back into here, one back into here so that it does its business. And then we're going to take that again, and we're going to go into the ADSR, and if you're noticing, every time the pitch changes, you can't see that. Every time the pitch changes, we're getting another trigger here. It's quick though, it's kind of hard to see. There we go. All right, so now let's take this control voltage that's being generated for the envelope and let's apply it to the VCA. There we go. Okay, so now we've got an oscillator that has a quantized control voltage driving its pitch, and we're using an ADSR, an envelope generator, to drive the contour of the volume for the quad VCA, which is going to our mixer. Let's get some effects going. So instead of going out to the mixer, I'm going to unplug. This has got all the sound. This has got all the magic. I'm going to unplug this and put it into my effects unit. I'm going to turn down all the things. And then we will come out of the effects unit into our mixer, which will do two things. It's actually going to give us a stereo version. But now we have reverb and delay and a filter. So our filter sounds like this, as I slowly roll off all the high frequencies and bring them back in. I also have a reverb. Reverb just makes everything magical. Okay. I also have though a delay, which is kind of neat. And one complaint I have about this module, though I do love it and I regret nothing, is that I find the delay sometimes a little hard to dial in, but I'm probably the only person with that issue. So there we go. Now we've got some effects on our sound source being controlled by some utilities. Today you learned. And to finish this off, I'm going to add in some percussion. I've got some gates figured out already. Squarp Rample's got that percussion that we had. So let's get plugged in here. There's my kick. And I've got a snare. We also talked about these vocal samples here, which are kind of neat. Let's take this and let's use some control voltage to sort of mess with it. So if I take a gate, I can mess with the playback a little bit. And that's on input X. And if I add some control voltage to this input, I can change where it plays back on that sample. Kind of like a scrub feature. I'm really into tape modalities. I'm not digging the sample for that patch. So what I can do is I can change the files that are playing back. And sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you don't. I'm not going to waste time on it. I know. Why don't we take our sample input and use the VCA to give that sample an envelope like we did before? So I'm just going to make that unit go through the VCA, and we're going to apply a different envelope to it. So let's see what that sounds like. Already, that just has a totally different sound. Now, another thing that we need to mess with sometimes is we need to do some attenuation of our control voltage. If you notice how big of a swing these notes have right now, that's because there's a big swing in the source voltage that's being used. But what we can do is we can actually run that control voltage through an attenuator, which is basically just a volume knob, and I can control how much of a swing it has. You see how now instead of being a really big staircase, it's a smaller staircase? Let's listen to that. I hope that you found this at least interesting. I'm looking forward to doing more of these. I'm going to be doing some showcases on individual modules. I'm going to do a couple challenges, make a patch only doing this. There will also be some live streams. So I'd highly recommend that you follow _Plains Music on Instagram. That's where most of the new stuff is going to be coming out. There's links in that profile for the YouTube channel as well as the Twitch account, because we will be doing live streams on a semi-regular basis. If you are in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada, and you want to collaborate, I want to collaborate with you, get in touch, tell me what you do, tell me what makes you excited, and yeah, peace.